Well, hello again, everybody. This is John Norris at Trading Perspectives. As always, we have our good friends, Sam Clement and Courtney Truss. Y'all say hello.
Hey, John.
How's it going?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for asking. You know, Sam, I might not be doing quite as awesome. Courtney, I might not be doing quite as awesome if I say, I don't know, perhaps lived in Ukraine?
I think you're pretty accurate
yeah.
there. It's hard to disagree.
Obviously, the threat of war, and it seems like we've talked about this here at Trading Perspectives, but really there's no other major news story out there but for the fact that recently Vladimir Putin, I guess the new czar, I forget what his title is, he is the czar of Russia in my opinion, said that they were going to legitimize or recognize breakaway provinces in Ukraine called Luhansk and Donetsk. I'm sure I'm butchering the Russian pronunciations of those names. But even so, that has led to a much wringing of hands and gnashing of teeth around the world in the Western's response to a lot of people. Due to this provocation, the West has responded kind of anemically in a lot of people. And Sam, Courtney, why do you think that is?
I think people don't want conflict, first of all. I think they're trying everything they can to avoid essentially World War III.
Yeah. I think that's the one thing I think about for my generation. Yes, with Iraq, the Iraq War, there were reasons, I guess that's a point of contention itself. But, you go back, it's been a long time since we've really faced war this closely, and a lot of it seems to kind of align with looking at Germany and other, like World War II, when there started to be slowly invasions of taking over certain areas, when they talk about that Putin might have a hit list of Ukrainians that he's gonna kill. And I think that gives me a lot of anxiety of what does that mean, how does that affect me here in the United States, but just in general, would we allow something like that to happen again, and are these early signs of something that extreme?
Now, Sam, a little bit closer to home for you, perhaps, is the potential for going over and defending Ukraine's sovereignty against the Russian bear.
A draftable age and possibly going and facing one of the world's superpowers is not that exciting to me.
Well,
I prefer not to.
It's kind of one of those deals. It's like, going over there and protect the Ukrainians from themselves, or the Russians.
Well, I have bone spurs, so that's not going to be an issue for me.
Or flat feet.
Say that sometimes you get nervous on airplanes and see what happens there. But even more than that is, it seems to me that, I would argue this, and this is not necessarily the viewpoint of Oakworth Capital Bank and all that good stuff, according to my caveat, is I think maybe part of the reason why Europe has not been quite as united in condemnation of Vladimir Putin and Russians' provocations in eastern Ukraine is the fact that they can't do without Russia, and they can't do without Russian energy. And they understand that far more so than I think perhaps Washington does. And although Washington has the numbers, it's just kind of hard to kind of look out there and go, okay, what does European economic production look like without Russian energy? Your thoughts?
Doesn't look great. And I think one thing that was interesting yesterday with Biden's comments that he came out with was he very much emphasized we will defend NATO countries. And he very much emphasized that as that being kind of the differentiator or kind of, I guess, where we draw the line of full-on, troops on the ground supporting these countries is the NATO countries, which obviously Ukraine is not a NATO country. So
as an observer or something like that?
It leads me to believe that, and what we're already seeing, that sanctions is what they mean by pushing back against Russia. And that's kind of, you're right, that's much more important to Europe, who is vastly more dependent on Russian energy than we are. But they are a huge supplier. To them, that's about almost 40% of their GDP comes from energy sector. So it's vitally important to Russia, and it's vitally important to the countries on the receiving end. So it's a kind of a tricky task, I think.
Well, in a lot of ways, Russia is more important to Europe than it is to the United States. And that kind of, all you have to do is take a look at a map or a globe in order to figure that one out. But, when I'm taking a look at things and just seeing what the remainder of Western Europe, or really just Europe in general, has done in terms of their consumption of energy and their production of it, really it's not even close, with the exception of Norway, which produces far more dead dinosaurs out of the North Sea than it consumes. But if you take a look at that, really, a lot of countries, no other country in the OECD in Europe produces more energy than it consumes. And that includes all types: nuclear, or so-called renewables, natural gas, petroleum, crude oil, all that stuff. So
is there any country that produces more than what they consume?
Norway's the only one.
Okay.
So, but when I'm sitting there taking a look at things like Italy produces only 21.5% of its energy. Germany produces 33.5%. And France only produces something like 40% or 50%. So there you have it. That's a lot of energy that has to come from somewhere, and some of it comes from the Norwegians, obviously, but the rest of it comes largely from the Russian bear. So, Sam and Courtney, I'm going to ask: is there some sort of parasitic relationship between the two of them where they can't live with one another, and that's part of the reason why sanctions on the Russian bear, with the Crimea, and sanctions over the last several years have been so toothless?
Well, that's exactly it, and it'll be more interesting as they get more and more aggressive, if they continue to get more and more aggressive, because there probably is going to try and be more pushback. But like you mentioned, no one's completely energy independent for the most part. 40% of the Russian economy comes from energy, and all these countries clearly are heavily dependent on them. So the only way to hurt the country is by essentially shooting yourself in the foot. I mean, there's no way.
Do you think this will stop Vladimir Putin for doing what he wants to do?
Absolutely not, in my estimation, because I think what will happen is they've got friends on their eastern borders, which will help them out in the short term with either the extension of credit or maybe even gobbling up some energy of their own.
I'm sure the Chinese can find some demand for energy.
That's exactly who I'm talking about. And, China and Russia have been getting closer and closer, really, over the last several years. And so I would imagine that's probably what would happen if Europe essentially says, we're not going to take any more of your energy. Germany forever sinks the Nord Stream 2 or whatnot, something along those lines. So they'll be able to they'll sell their energy someplace else, maybe not to the same degree. But what the problem is with that, if all of a sudden Europe is no longer consuming Russian energy, they're going to have to find some other sources of it.
And some of those sources are things they've tried to shut down recently.
And some of those things, so it's all of a sudden, if they've got to look for an alternative source for their energy, that's going to put pressure on the global energy markets just in general, which are already under pressure. If for no small part, the United States is now producing 10 to 15% less than what it was in 2019. So it's already kind of strained at $92 a barrel, thereabouts, for crude oil. What happens if we do all of a sudden all these horrible sanctions? Where does crude oil go then, Sam?
Well, it goes higher.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to
Why am I laughing at that?
I'm not going to put a price target on it, but I think the consensus is the worse this gets, the worse it gets for people at the pump and really anybody that's purchasing any sort of petroleum product.
So you see, I mean, do y'all kind of envision Vladimir Putin just laughing, being like, oh, okay, yeah, you can sit here and say that you're not going to buy my oil. Well, good luck, because it's just going to drive up cost that you already have in Europe and in the United States because we're not buying it from them.
I don't know if we're necessarily saying that, but I will say that Russia has a little bit more of a buffer than I think maybe Washington thinks that it does, and the fact that it has, in terms of foreign currency reserves, in excess of $600 billion.
And lots of gold.
And lots of gold, and it has all the energy it needs. It can consume that, and it can store its energy. It can store this stuff for a period of time, and then when the Europeans say, okay, we're not going to do this any longer, then it can flood the markets again with the energy. It's a little bit different game, I think, that Moscow's playing and Vladimir Putin's playing. It's a little bit different game than President Xi is playing. They're playing games as measured in decades and maybe even centuries, while we're playing it based on the next election cycle, midterm or presidential election cycle.
That's the point I was going to make. Is Putin is willing to endure more pain and allow his citizens to endure more pain because, again, he's not looking at what's going to happen in the midterms and what's going to happen 4 years from now. He is most likely going to be able to outlast any 4-year presidential cycle. So it's the same problem we've talked about with China, how they're talking in centuries and dynasties and not necessarily in 2 to 4 year cycles. And so it's really hard to level the playing field completely and to see who can bear more pain when you're comparing yourself with someone who has really no timeline.
Do you think that there's a threshold in which the United States would say, okay, once the price at the pump gets to this level, we would back off, or that we would dip into our reserves? Or what point can our consumers really absorb that extra cost?
Well, our reserves aren't as much as
right, yeah.
I mean, it's maybe 3 months supply on top of what we're producing internally. So it's not like that's not a lot of time that's not a lot of pain that you'd be able to bear, especially with midterms coming up. And I know both parties are focused on that, and as well as at the next presidential election. It's hard to imagine relying on reserves too much.
Yeah, and I think it would really be almost impossible. I mean, that would be something that the Washington would do in sort of a grand gesture, but that would not do much more than put a little bit of be like putting those one little tiny little circular Band-Aids, that aren't good for anything except for covering up zits, and trying to like put it over a massive wound on your arm. That type deal. Maybe not the best analogy, but it's what I thought.
The first one that came.
I'll do the big zit I've got on my face, and 53, it doesn't matter. You still get them. But that would be the type of thing, because right now, Courtney, this is very nerdy. It's not a lot of stuff that I talk about pretty nerdy. Right now, the Europeans are running a energy deficit. Sam, 38 quadrillion British thermal units. And that's on an annual basis. So that's quite a number of BTUs that it's got to come up with from somewhere, and it just can't be releasing some additional barrels of crude oil from the strategic reserve or saying fancy words or whatnot. That's a problem, and so. I don't think soft sanctions are going to work terribly well, and I don't exactly know how this is all going to work out where Vladimir Putin doesn't come out with maybe the slightly stronger hand.
It's definitely hard to imagine, especially, Russia's talking about just wanting these 2 provinces, and that's really all they're going to do. And then there's talk of the other Baltic countries who are the NATO countries, and what that would look like. And it's kind of almost a game of chicken, it feels like. Putin's probably pretty aware of what was going to happen if he brought troops into Ukraine. And he's definitely pretty aware of what would happen if he further escalated things. And so he knows what's going to happen. They know probably what they're willing to bear, and they'll just have to see how far the Western allies go.
Well, I mean, to that point, you're talking about, Europeans and, what's the pressure point in which Europeans are going to change their way of life, right? Because you're talking about Vladimir Putin looking at the long game, decades. Well, we already know, and just what y'all have shared with your statistics, they can't survive decades with this deficit. They'd have to look at alternative energy. Other than just consumers absorbing the astronomical cost of what it could mean, right, at the pump or whatever, what does it look like on looking at alternative technology or potentially people like trying to lower the demand?
Well, that's quite a reduction in demand that the Europeans would have to assume, considering that they've got that huge shortfall in terms of just their production and energy consumption. And there'd be no way that they could do it with solar panels and windmills. They would cover up most of the entire continent with that type of thing to come up with that. And therefore,
would it go to electric cars?
Even then, you've got to
get the electricity.
You've got to generate the electricity, and Europe's consumption of dead dinosaurs by gasoline in cars is nowhere near what ours is.
Right.
Yes, people have cars, but they're less reliant. They don't drive quite as far distances, for greater use of their feet, bicycles, as well as public transportation over there. So that's. They wouldn't be able to. I mean, that's just simply the point. That's part of the reason why Germany was so hard to get on board. That was part of the reason why Draghi down in Italy was so difficult to get on board. I mean, all these people understand that the energy mismatch, but at the same time, they don't want to necessarily tick off their ally, so-called ally, in terms of the United States, which is pushing for this. But this is going to be a relatively short-lived coalition, in my estimation, unless Putin really does go through and invade the remainder of Ukraine.
I think it's just worth noting how long this has been a head-scratcher, what Western Europe has done with their lack of energy independence. It seems like that just hasn't been a priority. I mean, shutting down nuclear plants, which by a lot of people's estimations, is one of the cleaner energies you can have when properly stored. And it's kind of like whether it was Russia invading Ukraine or something else happening, it was hard to imagine a scenario where it didn't come back to bite them, being so comfortable not being energy independent and setting these very restrictive goals on when they're going to be completely carbon neutral.
Well, just due to the overall globalization of things, there's a element of naivete that creeps through into people's minds, assuming that it's always going to be there. Mm-hmm. It's always going to be there. It's always going to be there at a relatively level price. You know, when the Greens over in Europe are talking about, you know, clean energy, it's all great, put up windmills and whatnot, without really understanding just the true economics of all this. Not going to sit there and say that their thought process is misguided. It's just their understanding of economics might be. And so here in the United States, what are we going to do with that shortfall? What happens if crude oil, natural gas prices go through the roof? You know, that's going to cause us some pain at the pump because we're more reliant on our automobiles. It also leads to distribution snafus, and that way it's going to be difficult for Courtney to get the creamer that she likes.
I know, it's already a struggle, John.
Or the sausage that her family likes. And so that's why she's going to have to stock up on such things.
But you talk about, you know, obviously even through COVID, when all of us were going to the grocery store and there weren't things on the shelves. I mean, how is this going to just continue to increase the likelihood that you're not going to be able to get the goods that you want? Or if you do find the goods that you want, they're going to be twice as much.
Well, there is, we talked about inflation and inflation excluding energy, but you're right in that when you take into the supply chain and everything that energy plays a part in, it's really hard to fully back out the role that energy plays in the prices of everything.
Well, it's got to get to the store,
sure.
You know, and just that
with
cost.
How, again, globalized we are. I mean, the vegetables you're eating are probably from another continent right now. And everything's getting shipped somewhere and then shipped somewhere else, and it adds up. Well,
it's also what we use fossil fuels in the creation of a lot of products that you might not know about.
Asphalt, paint, plastics, rubber.
All kinds of good stuff.
But yet not all of us are getting necessarily paid more, so you've just now dipping into that bucket of people not necessarily being... I guess we're going back to talking about the election.
Yeah,
and it's like, obviously, if you're not doing well, you're less likely to want to, you know, vote for the people currently in office because you're like, well, I'm in, you know, John, that goes back to you always say the president gets more of the blame when it's not their fault and they get more credit when it's not necessarily all their win either.
Okay.
And so in this regard...
I say it differently, but you're right.
Generally, you get the idea.
I agree with you on that.
But, I mean, to that point, like, I would be less inclined to want to vote for someone that I feel like, well, my quality of life is not as great. It's not necessarily whoever's acting president's fault necessarily 100%.
Well, I think there's always issues with when people vote, they don't understand fully the impact of what that person's policies play.
Right. Yeah.
And they don't feel like things necessarily impact them. But gas prices is something that is probably pretty unique in that it impacts just about every single person in this country.
Yeah.
If not completely directly, then very much indirectly.
Yeah, there's a super strong correlation between political dissatisfaction and energy prices. It is hard to be very optimistic about the current administration or whatever administration's in play when energy prices are soaring and every dollar in your pocket, it seems to be running out a little bit quicker.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. And we've also talked about the coalition kind of falling apart if there's too much pain. And I would say that's going to be relatively quickly. You know, here we are in central Alabama, one of the more conservative states in our country, frankly, one of the more militaristic as well. It's kind of weird. There's a pretty strong correlation between the two, conservative and militaristic. And I don't know too many people that are all bowing up and prancing around saying we've got to go over there with a bunch of troops and knock the crap out of Vladimir Putin over what's going on in the Ukraine. I don't think Washington's really made a very strong case that we've got to go over there with a strong military solution for this. About what the events in the Ukraine. Maybe they're out there, maybe some people are bothered about it, but I don't know that many people that I've spoken to about it. So when you throw in not only that, where the average American don't want to send U.S. troops over there, and then the potential for higher crude oil prices and therefore higher energy prices, people are going to go, no way. I don't really care. And that might not be the tack that we need to take for the history books. However, you're right. According, people tend to vote with their pocketbooks, and people tend to, if they're feeling it at the pump, and all of a sudden it costs you, that much more to cart your kids around town and all that stuff. People are going to say enough is enough. We just don't care enough, and that, frankly, I think that's kind of where a lot of people are here in the United States. Don't care enough about something that's halfway around the world, and in Europe they know that they've got an energy mismatch. So I really think that this is going to end up being, score one for Russia.
So you think it'll be short-lived, at least the sanctions?
I think it'll be. The sanctions might be long-lived. The strict adherence to the sanctions, probably not so much. If you catch my drift.
Yeah.
Sam, your thoughts?
I think the big caveat is how much further they push things. I think you're absolutely right. I think Ukraine not being a full NATO member complicates things in terms of what we would do, and I think as long as it doesn't necessarily go further than where it's at, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think if they start invading Baltic NATO countries, I think we may have a different issue, and my bone spurs may get a little stronger.
Well, I got to tell you, this could be probably a pretty unpopular thing. We're obviously going a little bit long here today. In terms of what Vladimir Putin wants in Washington, people haven't made the strong case here and would go fight for it, and U.S. citizens probably aren't exactly clear how Russians think. Courtney, I'm going to ask you, how would you like it if the Russians put up a whole bunch of troops on the southern border of the United States?
Oh, of the United States?
Yeah.
No, I'd be very nervous about it.
Okay. Sam, what do you think?
Again, as a draftable male, I would not like that.
Yeah, so that's kind of the way the average Russian's taking a look at it, and that's probably not a very popular viewpoint to point that out, but that's kind of what's going on in a lot of ways. And, Putin's thinking in decades. Doesn't want to have NATO on his back door, although he could argue that it is with the Baltics, but okay, have to live with that. But Ukraine's a different kettle of fish, I think, in my estimation. All right, well, gang, we'll see how it all plays out, but perhaps it'll go away kind of quietly, or perhaps it'll be long-lasting. I think the more pain that consumers, and in particular U.S. consumers, feel at the pump or in their electric bills or what have you, the more we will push back on alleviating this crisis in some form or fashion, because I don't know too many Americans that really care too much about the geopolitical consequences, rightly or wrongly, about this, because it is half a world away. It truly is. And you can make a strong argument it's more of a European problem than an American problem. Sam, your thoughts?
I agree.
All right. And Courtney, your thoughts on that?
Yep.
All right. So, I would agree with you all on that, and I would say that we always love hearing from you all. So if you have any questions or comments, please, by all means, let us know. If you want to read more or hear more of what we have to say or how we think, please go to oakworth.com, take a look underneath the Thought Leadership tab, where you can always reach out to us at tradingperspectives@oakworth.com, and even leave us a review on the podcast outlet of your choice. And I completely said that differently than I normally do, and Sam, I'm not sure if you noticed that.
Same point got across.
I think so. Y'all have anything else to say on this topic?
That's it.
That's all.
That's all I've got today, too. Y'all take care.